So we've spoken about how the 9-panel grid can be used to facilitate pacing and time, and we've discussed how it can be used as a visual prison to trap characters into its rigid format and structure. But the 9-panel grid also has something else unique about its format, in that it's got a central panel. There's one panel sitting right in the middle of the page, and everything else sits around it. If you look at it a certain way, it could be seen like it's the center of attention, right? I mean, everything else can gravitate around that central panel in the page, and there's a kind of power to that, or at least there can be if you use the 9-panel grid and its center panel in such a way. So in Panel by Panel issue 4, which is the digital magazine I edit all to do with comics, comics craft, and critical writing about comics, Tom King and Mitch Gerads were interviewed, and part of that conversation was about their use of the 9-panel grid in Mr. Miracle, which is that issue's feature book. And King mentioned the power of the 9-panel grid's center panel. He said, "You don't get a center panel, panel 5 out of 9, with even paneled grids, and I like to do something in that center panel that's key to the page." So to discuss this, I want to turn back to King's work with Gabriel Walta, Jordie Bellaire and Clayton Cowles in Marvel's awesome Vision series. I don't want to exclusively talk about the 9-panel grid in this though, because it's not actually the only way to get a center panel. You can just add one to any page layout, and here Walta does do that a few times, but it's a clear example of the power a central panel has in the 9-panel grid too, so it's easily translatable. I've picked out a handful of pages here that have excellent uses of a central panel, and I want to work through them to show you how that panel works in the context of the page, and specifically sort of why it works, because it's not just about putting something in the middle panel and leaving it at that, there's a bit more to that process. And so here in that first example, we see Vision coming home and his wife waiting for him. This is the final issue of the series, by the way, a series that has all mostly been about one thing. If we look at the middle panel of this page, it reveals to us essentially the summation of this whole story. Vision looking on at the photo of his family, actually it's an Easter egg as well to the first issue's front cover, the idyllic vision of the family unit Vision has created. In the background, looking on with a worried face, is Vision. Visually, that actually sums up the emotional and mental state of Vision particularly well, while also giving us another refresher and reminder as to what this series was always ultimately about. Walta also adds some further depth to this, as it's the first panel where you see Vision really emote on the page. And also, he's naked, which is a visual representation of the moment. Looking at his family, it's like his soul is laid bare on the page and we're seeing this visually. There's nothing for him to hide behind anymore. He can't hide behind the superhero part of himself, and he can't hide behind this family unit version of himself, as we'll see in a second. The door theme, with the Vision tied to the house by literally almost being part of its form, is something that plays out throughout a lot of the book, and specifically a lot of the ending of this issue as well, but it's worth noting through all those different elements really just how well this encapsulates everything going on here in this book. Even Cowles places the caption box in between Vision and the photo of his dream family to break them apart. There's a disconnect here. The middle of the page also constitutes the turning point for the scene visually, because before this panel, Vision is in his superhero costume, and afterwards he's in his normal home clothes, which represents the two sort of sides of his character. In that middle panel is his nakedness. Before that, he's Vision the superhero, after that, Vision the family man. But that nakedness is really interesting and surprising because it's his family almost that puts him into that situation. Between those two elements of himself, between the one that wants to have this perfect family and be a normal person, and the version of himself that's this superhero in his superhero costume saving the world, between that is this ideal he wants to reach, and that's encapsulated in that image of his family. So it's interesting that that actually takes place specifically right in the middle of the page and right in the middle of the sequence. And the middle panel is also visually different in that it's the only panel where Vision isn't large in the image, or really the main point of focus. Panel 1, his feet and legs loom large. 2 is all about him coming home, 3 is him heading up the stairs, 4 is a full body shot on him, 5 is obviously the middle panel, 6 is close on his face, 7 on his tie and logo, 8 is a full body shot, and 9 he looms large on the right side, but in the middle the predominant feature of that image is actually his family. To use the example from the start of the video, it all gravitates around that. So the main concerns for the center panel are to be different in some way. The power truly comes, I think, from making that central panel different enough that it helps itself stand out as a central turning point, or the central concept for the page and scene. So a little later in that same issue of Vision, we get a page that isn't quite a 9-panel grid, though it's actually not that far off, but it also has a central panel for the page in much the same way. Here again, the center image is a drastic departure from every other image on the page. Vision's wife, Virginia, has drank some of this floating vase and it's killing her. So that's really quite important to the moment of the page. The reason this works so well is that the vase in the middle doesn't interact in any way with the scene. You know, there's no clear identifier that anyone is even looking at it, but it's just sitting ominously in the center of the page. And everything else really only starts to work in relation to that, and much like the Dark Side Is panels in Mr. Miracle, you can't escape from its obviousness on the page, purely because of how distinct a visual it is. If you add in Bellaire's colouring choice of brightening the vase beyond anything else, the page is really working to send your attention right to the middle of the page, the most important element of the scene. And this really is one of my favourite pages, and probably one of the best pages I think in all of the Vision series, because in all its silence and lack of captions and words, the story is very beautifully and very simply told. But the page relies on that middle panel existing, the vase representing death, and it relies on it being placed where it is, touching every other panel. Literally the whole world, the whole page, the whole scene gravitates around that central idea and image, and it can't help but feed into everything you see. And sure, there are moments where the middle panel is also less striking visually, though this idea still works, I think. In an earlier issue, there's a moment where the head teacher at the school that the two kids of the Vision family go to, which is Viv and Vin, and they're talking about asking the kids to leave because they're dangerous. It's a sequence of people talking around what they really mean, you know, figuring out ways of putting things delicately so to not upset anyone. Each panel has got quite a wordy set of balloons, all at least 2. Until that centre panel, which is just Virginia and a lot of negative space around it here, and her one single balloon. My children are not guns. And visually it does look different than the rest of the page that's come before it, and in terms of the sequence of panels, it marks a turning point much like what we saw in the first example with Vision coming home. So the centre panel works as a way to suddenly shift and jar the page, throwing it from one end to the other. And so you can use that middle panel in a 9-panel grid, or even just in the page construct in which you heavily emphasize a 9-panel grid, as a way to showcase the main point of your sequence. By making it visually look different to everything else in some capacity, you know, be it the colours or the framing, or a departure from the regular style, or even just changing the amount of dialogue and text you have in it, you give that central panel some power and agency. And with that, you can force a reader to notice something particular, be it the turning point of the page and sequence by way of the first and third examples, or as a way to constantly draw your reader back to the middle panel as a way to inform everything else taking place around it, such as the second example with the vase. You know, with that tool, you can be subtle or you can be bombastic in your approach, but it's a valuable one in the arsenal of the 9-panel grid that you really don't want to waste. Thanks for watching. If you're a fan of Strip Panel Naked, you should check out the Patreon, where I post new exclusive content every single week. There's over a year's worth of stuff in there already, so go take a look and consider pledging. For more comics talk and analysis, you can find me on Twitter at HassanOE. You can buy your copy of Panel by Panel at panelxpanel.com. And finally, hit subscribe and that notification button to keep up to date with all the latest episodes, and I'll see you next time.